Romans were going where the metal was. They were keen to get it, and there was a lot in this area. And this is where we find this strong tradition that the Romans were there. And here they have the Roman bridge. This is Fortingall. This is at the entrance of Glen Lyon. Fortingall in the Gaelic, Frirtingall-aerial, it means the stronghold of the strangers. The question is, who were the strangers? Galloway means the land of the strangers. So the strangers equate to the Gael. And here's the famous Fortingall yew tree. Some of you will know about it. It's reputedly the oldest living vegetation in Europe. It's now believed to be 5,000 years old, so it's 3000 BC, which is contemporary with the stone circle, what we just looked at, which is just a few miles away at Croft-Moraig. So this was 3,000 years old at the time of Christ. When they measured the girth of the tree about 1770, it was 56.5 feet. It's a huge tree. Subsequently, the youth around about the late 18th century were lighting Beltane fires. In the centre of the tree, they burnt the centre of the tree out, but it's still there until like 2 pieces. But despite all that, after 5,000 years, this tree is still thriving. So the big question is, why was it planted there? And what's giving it its life force? Why is it still thriving after 5,000 years? And it's in this particular Fortingall-Glen Lyon area where there are so many interesting connections. At the time of Christ, the Scots king, called Metellanus, that was the Latinized name. In the Middle Ages, when they came to write down the history from the old Gallic records, they wrote it in Latin. So Metellanus was the Latinized name of the king, and the clues in his name, Metellanus. The guy was very much involved, according to the old Scots chronicles, in mining. He was one of the wealthiest kings of the time, and he had his seat here at Fortingall. Just behind the yew tree, on a slightly elevated hill, there's a hill fort called Dungiel. It means the White Fort. And white in ancient times was synonymous with spiritual or holy. That's why the Druids wore white. The early Celtic monks, the Chaldees, wore white. The Essenes wore white. So white is significant with holy, with spiritual, but it can also imply spiritual power. This fortress could be a sacred power point. And that obviously, you know, if the king would have been advised by the Druids, which he would have had in his entourage, they would have known where the power points were. So if he's going to have a fort, to have his seat, from whence he's commanding out, from his radiating out, from the area, tribal area that he sort of reigns over, he's going to pick a power point, the White Fort, Dungiel. And those of you that have looked into the French connection, Rennes-le-Chateau, so-and-so, what do we get? We get Blanchefort, the White Fort. It's a power point. So Metellanus was the king at the time of Christ, and there's an interesting local oral tradition that a relative of King Metellanus was none other than Pontius Pilate. And that's a bit of a blockbuster when you start getting your head around that, because there's nowhere else in Europe or the UK which has an oral tradition saying that that's the birthplace of Pontius Pilate. And yet there's a strong oral tradition in this remote region in the Central Highlands of Scotland that Pontius Pilate was born at Fortingall and related to this king. He was of Gallic royal ancestry. And he just happens to turn up at that key node in human history, the crucifixion in Palestine. This is an aerial view of Fortingall, taken by, I think it was in 1986, and these are held by the Royal and Ancient Historical Monuments Society down in Edinburgh. And you can see these arrows. There's a line running across. Let's use the pointer. There it is, there. It's running around here, fades a bit, and it comes through there. There's the yew tree. So this appears to be what's called a vallum, and implies there could have been a very early monastic site, possibly a Christian monastic site centred here, of which we've no historical record. So it could be very early indeed. And it's centred on the yew tree, which would have been highly venerated at the time of Christ in the early centuries AD. What we do know is that the current church here, There's a church right next to the yew tree, Fortingall Kirk. The current one was put up in 1902. Before that, there was a pre-Reformation church, and before that, we know that there was an early Celtic church site there going back to about the 600s AD. But this balance suggests there could have been something there even before that. So the big question is, what was going on here? Now, the early Celtic monastic tradition in North Britain in particular, they were known as the Chaldees. It comes from a Gaelic word, Chaldic, which means certain strangers, strangers from afar. And in the Latin it's Chaldae, it means servants of the Lord or servants of God. So who were these strangers from afar who were servants of the Lord? And this again, this was the Fortingall, the stronghold of the strangers. So these strangers somehow were connected with the Gael, and yet they were servants of the Lord, strangers from afar. What my research tends to suggest is that there was an Essene mission, probably several missions, that brought the Christ message out from the Middle East to the British Isles very early on, 1st century AD. Part of that revolves around the stories and legends of Joseph of Arimathea coming to the southwest of Scotland. There are also folklore legends linking Joseph of Arimathea to the Isle of Skye, where we had the Temple of Anitus. There's even a tradition that Joseph of Arimathea was buried in Scotland and not at Glastonbury. So I think what was happening is that there were these Essene groups coming out from the Middle East, 1st century AD, and they were connecting with the pre-existing Druid Magi, who were really on the same wavelength. And what happened was there was a fusion between that Essenic Christian message from the Middle East with the Druid Magi, and out of that evolved Celtic spirituality, Celtic Christianity, the monastic line known as the Chaldees. Close by to Fortingall, we've got place names called Calder Moor and Calder Beg, which implies Chaldee sites. So this could have been an early Chaldee site, the fort of the strangers, the Chaldees, the Chaldic, the strangers from afar. And I think this is what happened. As I say, the Essenes came over, connected with the Druids who had clairvoyantly seen what was going on. According to the Irish tradition, they'd seen, they knew about the crucifixion of Christ, and they were very receptive to the Christ message. Basically because behind the whole Christ thing in the Middle East and the Druid thing here, we'd got pre-Christian mystic schools who'd been liaising with each other. So there was also, I think there was interaction, pre-Christian, between the Essenes of the Middle East, which go back at least to the 2nd century BC, and the Druids here. According to the Scots Chronicles, 2nd century BC, Egyptian philosophers were advising the Scots kings. And also they're coming from Spain as well. So there's a collection through, there's a big strong link through ancient Iberia, Spain, from the Middle East. Not very clear here. Now, this is the Lituus symbol. It's coming back to Pilate again. It's like the shepherd's crook, and it's called a Lituus symbol. And these are found on Pilate's coins, which are peculiar to his coins alone. Of all the Roman prefects of Judea, many of them use very similar symbols, usually Roman symbols. But this Lituus symbol is only found on Pilate's coins. It's quite interesting. Now, the thing is, they found this same symbol on coins, Celtic bracket, it quotes, coins in Britain, 1st century BC, 1st century AD, contemporary with Pilate. We find the same symbol coming on British coins. Now, the Lituus is a symbol of augury or divination. So it's been suggested that Pilate had studied as an augur, divining. Now, this is exactly what the Druids were into. Now, if he was related to King Metellanus at Fortingall, who would have had Druid counsellors and advisors and bards in his entourage, Pilate would have had a Druidic education, instruction. So is that the connection? What's this guy, why is there a oral tradition linking him to this particular area, and he just happens to turn up at this key position? in this dramatic event in human history. The turning